Welcome to Wabash Center's Seasons of a Teaching Career. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. Our producer's desk is filled with Rachel Mills, and Paul Myrie is our sound engineer and creative director. In general, this particular series is to support our early career colleagues. We are asking these kinds of questions in the 3 episodes. What is a thriving scholar? What is a healthy scholar? Who is a flourishing scholar? In this third of 3 conversations, this episode is particularly focused on creativity and imagination. What does it mean to flourish and make use of creativity and imagination in the early career? My conversation partners for these 3 episodes are Dr. Leah Payne. Leah is Associate Professor of Theology at Portland Seminary, George Fox University, and Dr. Roger Nam. Roger is Professor of Hebrew Bible, Candler School of Theology, Emory University. Welcome both of you to the conversation. Thank you for this continued conversation.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for hosting us.
So we are particularly interested in the notion of creativity and imagination because so many of us understood ourselves at least a little bit, and some a lot, before the PhD program or before higher education as being creative, of being imaginative, of being divergent thinkers, of liking form and function and color and shape and all those kinds of things, thinking wildly, thinking, fancifully. And then we kind of hit the PhD program and we're kind of straitjacketed, kind of stifled, kind of told disciplinary approaches or even personal approaches by our mentors to our work, to our syllabi, to our approaches in scholarship. Now we find ourselves on faculties as early career folks, wanting to flourish, remembering a little bit that flourishing comes through creativity and imagination. We want to bring our authentic selves. We want to bring our genuine voices. We know there's a connection to creativity and imagination. And yet, we still carry the wounds, the bruises, the lessons, the formation of a process that told us, be as stifled as possible. So Leah, help us, right? Jump in here anywhere. What would it mean to reclaim our creativity and imagination?
I don't know about you all, but there's one moment in my mind that stands out to me as, I would say, me at peak conformity. And it's a moment where I took a picture with my dissertation committee, and I cannot tell you, it was the moment preparing for my defense. I was the scaredest I've probably ever been. It was just like sheer terror. And I wore an outfit that to me was something that that somebody on my committee would have worn. I don't even know why I made that decision, but I think that was me thinking, okay, I need to look the part. And so I chose a particular kind of outfit, and I won't share it because I don't want anybody to speculate which member of my committee I was sort of kind of trying to be their mini-me. But I think that was me trying my absolute hardest to tick every box. And I think most people who end up getting a PhD were very achievement-oriented people. But when we were preparing for this conversation, that moment stood out in my mind as the moment where I was just throwing everything into scrubbing my own personality out of the PhD process. And at least for me, and I'd love to hear from you all, it took me a long time to start to think, maybe that wasn't the best idea. I mean, if it gets you a PhD, you think it's working for you in some sort of way. But it took me a long time. But that's the moment that stands out in my mind as, whoa, that's high conformity. What about you all?
Well, I mean, I think those of us who are artists, those of us who are creative and are imaginative, know that oftentimes fear signals that we're on the verge of something new, something positive, something marvelous. As you're raising, Leah, fear can also say you are well on your way to conforming to mediocrity, to being a mini me. So learning the kinds of fears that we have and how to steer ourselves more toward creativity and away from conformity might be the bigger lesson here. Roger, what do you think?
Well, the conformity is, what you say, Leah, is so much an exemplar, which is symbolic. But within the conformity, there's this lived reality as a PhD student that is so totalizing. And for Hebrew Bible students, there is ironically a canon of secondary literature that we all must master. All of us read the same things that our advisors read. And these are things that their advisors read or wrote themselves. So every PhD student has read Martin Note, right? Everyone has read Gerhard von Rad. In a prior generation, every PhD student in Hebrew Bible took Akkadian. And I have nothing against these books. I actually just taught a doctoral seminar on Akkadian, but there's so much more beyond the so-called canon of literature that leads us to flourish as an early career scholar and an early career teacher. But there's also so much in place in the system that does straitjacket you into a particular node of scholarship, and that expression is very stifling towards our natural inclinations towards creativity and imagination.
I don't know about you all, but for me, I had this from one of my favorite creative things is to read science fiction, watch science fiction. I was doing all of that when I was finishing my PhD. I was watching Battlestar Galactica. Love the reboot. Anyway, I had, and it was like two selves. And for me, I think the early career process has been to try to figure out how to incorporate more of that love and that appreciation for the creative process when you're on the other side of finishing that PhD, because of course you're not going to get your dissertation through if you don't, as you said, Roger, you got to have these books, but it's been a process of learning how to integrate those two forms of myself. Was that your experiences?
I think after I went to an unorthodox PhD program that did not strip me of my creativity, but insisted that I be imaginative and creative. So I did not go through what I have seen my colleagues go through, which to me looks like a recompression. That's what I'm going to call a recompression, that somehow they had been tamped down and crushed down and beat down. And they spent like the first 3 or 4, 8 or 9 years trying to come back to themselves. And some were successful, and I'm going to say some weren't so successful. But I do think those who, from my eye, were successful were those who were able to create their own syllabi in their own voices, get the authenticity of their own style of teaching out into their own classrooms in meaningful ways. You know what I mean? That they worked at certain practices of teaching that brought them back to themselves.
Yeah, our identity as a professor is so subconsciously shaped by our own experiences as a student. And so that we intrinsically replicate that experience. And in doing so, I think it does real disservice and impoverishes our own teaching ability, because we do come with such unique identities, especially now. And we're embodied in ways, and we have backgrounds that are very different from the professors that we studied with. And if we are just to replicate that which has been modeled for us, it really actually impoverishes, I think, the student experience of us as professors. So I think it is crucial for us to really build those muscles to flourish of creativity and imagination as scholars, and especially as teachers early in our career.
I wholeheartedly agree. And also just as a way to have fun. Because, in terms of, I don't know about you all, but this at the end of every semester, I'm pretty tired, and having a little bit more fun and feeling that the classroom and even the syllabus has been a creative project is more sustainable for me. It just feels like it's not just, we got that done. Although there's always a little bit of that feeling, but it's also, wow, look what we did together. This is pretty wonderful.
It's much more generative as a teacher when you're able to own that and design it yourself. That's really authentic to who you are.
Well, I think, and the word generative to me is right on, right? So what are you building together as a conversation in your class? What is the syllabus helping the learners to build together? That kind of generativity, I think, is important, and oftentimes not the way we were taught or the way we were taught to teach, right? So we know even for our own selves, we might be in new territory, figuring out new things. I told a colleague this semester that when I was teaching, I'm just an administrator now, administrating. It took me I had to teach a class 3 times before I felt comfortable that this was a good way to teach the class. And he was surprised because his mentality was, which I think is the more typical mentality, as long as I get the information right in the syllabus, get the readings right, get the then it's in the can, then I have it. And I didn't look at my classes that way. I looked at it in terms of what were the experiences of the students? Are they having the kinds of, am I choreographing the kinds of experiences that would be generative for them? That's a different assessment of the experience we're building together. And it took me at least 3 times, sometimes longer, depending on the class, to say, yes, I get my syllabus, I get my students, this thing is coming together to create something, a kind of gestalt for us all.
And not to the social context. You're teaching later than your experiences. You're doing it in a different setting, geographical, with different students. And it would be foolish to try to replicate that which has been given to you. And it's a good early career scholar to develop those habits, to think carefully about the context and to own them, to think about how can I help create a classroom that will make the most use of me and the most use of this context to get us to whatever the mission is of the class.
Well, and some creativity and imagination doesn't always mean complexity and expansion, right? Sometimes it was about elegance and trying to figure out the more simple thing, the less cluttered ways to engage my students. That in of itself helped my flourishing and my voice, as well as help the students. So I don't think we're trying to message all creativity is the same and all imagination is the same, and it's all kind of zany and whimsical, right? That's not what we're talking about.
No, I was actually thinking about, I've become sensitive over the last couple of years just to the emotional arc of a semester. You know, you kind of start, most students at least, and professors too, you start with a kind of excitement and optimism, and then, you know, somewhere around weeks 6 through 10, it's kind of a slog. And then you get, at least for me and for many students, I think they get ideally a sense of accomplishment and sometimes euphoria, you know, especially if they're graduating, like we did it. And I think, you know, one of the most creatively satisfying things that I've been experimenting with, and I don't even, you know, I like teaching as a practice, you know, so who knows if I'm getting there, but is to be sensitive and to structure a class in a way that takes that emotional journey into account. Of course, you know, it's every student is in their own has their own things going on. So sometimes students have really remarkable experiences that happen along the way that might disrupt the ideal form of it. But that's been to me, that's the really creatively exciting part, is to think about what's a kind of class that you can create that takes in those natural rhythms into account. I get excited about that.
Also, an indicator for me was for the students, usually with good student skills, right? Who, when the assignment wasn't write this mundane thing and listen to these mundane lectures, when they said, I'm really going to have to engage you and this material and my colleagues, the other students in this class, and I just thought I was going to phone this in, that was an indication that I was doing a better thing, right? So we don't want students to get so complacent that they know how to phone stuff in just because of their quote good student skills. Right. So Roger, you have a video. You have something for us.
I have something. I just have some slides to share with you. But part of this is I don't want to talk just theoretically, but I want to give like concrete examples of creativity and imagination early in my career. So I actually have 2 examples of creativity and imagination, and one example when you should not display any creativity and imagine. It'll be a little contrarian to ourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share. And I want to give you some concrete examples of what it means to display creativity and imagination, especially during the early career of your teaching season. And so these are actual examples that I had to break out of the straitjacketing of what a professor looks like and to move to something different. They all centered around the aspect of theological education. And my institution had kind of a hybrid goal. One was, of course, knowledge and cognition, but there was a secondary goal of formation. And I think I felt like the curricular model was a little bit too much geared towards the cerebral over the formative aspects. So here's a few things that I did, specifically 2 examples of displaying creativity and imagination, and 1 example of not displaying creativity and imagination deliberately. And the first thing in creativity and imagination, the first example was in the classroom. So brand new professor, and I am assigned to teach an intensive, which means 8 hours of class time in one day. Nobody wants to deliver content for 8 hours. Nobody wants to receive content for 8. Not a single student wants this. So what I did, and like to say this was part of my pedagogical purpose, but really it was an act of survival, was create kind of a break in the class beyond the normal lunch break. And so I had this assignment of take 2 hours in a discipline of silence and find a comfortable space on campus or nearby campus, drive to a coffee shop or something like that, go to a park, and reflectively read the assigned passage, return to the classroom at 3 p.m. after 2 hours with 1 takeaway and 1 question on the passage. So this is providing some space for them to digest, to model for them a practice of reflective reading and not just frenetic pace of reading page after page after page after page. This is very different from the way that a lot of us experience graduate school, especially the PhD program, when you have these enormous expectations of reading. And it also provided a break for the students in terms of not having to interact, being able to slow down and actually have a generative time in the middle of the day. And especially the poor introverts that are forced to be in class for 8 hours had this opportunity to kind of step back and recharge and enjoy a brief text. So that was something I did during class time that actually ended up working pretty well, even though admittedly it was just for my pure survival. The second thing was imagination and creativity in assignments. So one assignment I like to do pretty regularly is something I call a 1-hour reflection. Now these assignments, the instruction is 60 minutes, no more, no less. And these are pass fail. And I guarantee the students, if you spend 60 minutes, then you will pass no matter what. I want to ease up their nervousness. I want to kind of calm down the overzealous students that want to get that A. Just spend 60 minutes. I limit it to 1 to 2 passages and no more than 3 questions. And I also limit the response to 1 page total, ideally written, handwritten. And so what I have them do is spend 60 minutes in a space to read a passage and reflect on 3 questions. And I have them write down their responses to the prompt in no more than 1 single-sided space of page space. And one example, what this looks like is read Genesis 15 and Genesis 17. And to address the question in like 3 inches of space, is the Abrahamic covenant unconditional or conditional? To force them to sit and to enjoy a cup of coffee and to think about the passage, read it and reread it, and reflect on this question. And in terms of, this is never an assignment I got, but in terms of me as a professor, this was actually a joy to grade because I got to see really the spirit of the students, their journeys, their narratives. I had them examine the theological assumptions. You can imagine within the theologically diverse student body, the ways they would approach that question, which of course, cannot be succinctly answered, but at least to get them to think about that. What about the text drives them to that response? So 2 spaces where you can display creativity and imagination as an early career scholar, and 1 space where you cannot, and that is in scholarship. When you think about the long trajectory of your career, you have to think about the long game in your own embodied agency. And in building our embodied agency as teacher scholars, sometimes we need to strategically fit the guild. And what that means is there are a lot of things that you can challenge about the first book academic monograph, But in order to maintain your space, to get tenure, or to get your first full-time job, you really need to get that first book, that first academic monograph. And there's places where you really need to kind of put some corners on the creativity and imagination that you display. There are many ways to do scholarship, but in theological education, still that first book is so crucially important.
I think that's very helpful. I think one of the indicators for our viewers and for our listeners might be, if I'm not going to be the sage on the stage, who am I going to be with my learners, right? So many colleagues grew up with only the sage on the stage,
right?
Only the information giver. Well, in an information age, that's fairly ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
You can get the information literally from everywhere, not one particular place, but everywhere. So then what is your role as a teacher in the classroom if it's not the sage on the stage? And the point is, you get to pick, you get to decide.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to bring your best self, not your barely competent self, into the classroom as teacher?
Right. And it was, like I said, serendipitous for me. Like I was just looking for a break in my 8 hours of teaching. But in doing that, in trying to figure out how can I take a break without doing a 3-hour lunch, and thinking, well, this could work. And, it's been never done for me. The professor never did that for me, either in seminary or in graduate school. But it kind of worked out. And so I think it's really important and crucial for us to kind of dig deep into our imagination to help our classrooms flourish in ways that we perhaps haven't experienced for ourselves.
And that pragmatism might be the best place in imagination, right?
There's so much survival in the early career. There's
right.
So much survival. You're so tired.
Helping your students is helping you, right?
Yeah.
That is a kind of mutuality, reciprocity that we're looking for.
And to not feel guilty about it, because like literally I say goodbye at like 11:50 a.m. I'm not going to see them till 3. And, honest, I dealt with some guilt. Am I being a delinquent professor by doing that? And so to be okay with that, because
we're not hourly workers, we're not factory workers. Yeah. We have not commodified. If I say 1,000 words a minute, then I'm worth my paycheck. It doesn't work like that.
It doesn't work that way, but it took me some time to realize that. I just remember is this okay? And then after a couple of, this is not just okay. This is actually really good.
I think especially for biblical studies, something like that is so important because students, I'm not a biblical studies professor, so you'll have to tell me, but a lot of the students that I talk with in church history or religious history, they really do need a lot of space to process what's happening to them. And especially students who come from backgrounds that give a lot of authority to certain kinds of biblical interpretation. This kind of work, you need some space there to do some soul searching and some work. So I think the lesson here is your pragmatism. It pays off in so many other ways.
Right. And so in biblical, I still read this way. I don't know if you guys read this way, but I could read, but I keep in mind the page count, because I want to finish the book or I want to finish the article or the chapter, which in many ways is an unhealthy way of reading, but we know how we got there because we need to read 50,000 words for our comp or 50,000 pages for our comps on such and such date. And so you will outline a schedule. I need this many pages every day. And so to enforce a practice of truly reflective reading, where maybe you're only reading 4 verses and giving yourself the freedom to pour yourself a cup of coffee, to sit down in silence and just to think about that. And I think that is a tremendous formative practice that I think is really valuable for us to model and to nurture in our students, for those of us at institutions of theological education.
And what you're describing are contemplative approaches to teaching, right? So if people want to know more about it, we're not inventing the wheel here. We know about contemplative practices of teaching, contemplative ways of teaching any subject that we're teaching. One of the ways, so I would spend as much time or more time crafting learning activities for my classroom sessions as I would for my syllabus. A lot of people will, once they finish their syllabus, they're done with the crafting and designing, right? But for me, the payoff was in the learning activities and sometimes the assignments, but mostly the learning activities. One of the ways I assessed, again, the learning activities for a whole semester was, how many times during the semester did I engage all the senses of a class? Right? That was one of my criteria. Have we engaged all the, not in any one day, any one session,
Right.
right?
A minute.
Boom, boom, boom. But over the arc of the semester, how many times did we engage them all? And if we left one out, why did we leave it out? And is there a way to get it in? So that those kinds of standards, asking myself those creative questions, setting those kinds of imaginative standards, helped me not just do stuff for stuff's sake, but to put myself empathetically in the shoes of the student who need body, mind, and spirit to be in the classroom with them, and not just a neck up experience from learning and engaging with this person called teacher.
That's such a great assessment, because think about our own PhD training. What senses did we engage? The sight, and sometimes a sore wrist from writing, and
or typing. Right?
That's it.
Typing.
That's all the senses that we engaged in our doctoral studies, which were super intense. And
tired of sitting still and staring at screens.
Yeah.
Right. That's not enough. Right. That's not enough.
This year, I teach a class on the history of Christianities in the Americas broadly, and every year when we're face to face, we have a potluck, because we just talk about, and we have this great conversation about, food and food cultures and religious traditions. And this year we couldn't meet together. And so the students, I had the students do little separate small groups in groups of 3. They had potlucks together, and they made their favorite church food, whatever that was. We had students from all over the country, and a couple of international students as well. And it was, I got to attend a couple of them. I am not a crier, but I got kind of emotional watching the students talk about their food experiences, their religious experiences, how that was shaping, their seminary. All that to say, I think that more holistic engagement with theological learning is so key, because, religious movements themselves, even if we're going to understand them, they're not just screens, there's this whole set of sights and sounds. So I get really excited when I hear about this kind of stuff, and I'm looking forward to more face-to-face teaching interactions.
So we're kind of clear that we don't want to do the banking system anymore, right? We just don't want to open people's heads and kind of dump stuff into it. But we're less clear about, okay, if we're not going to do that, then what are we going to do? Because, and I'm back to those stifling things, that real teaching, real scholarship is lecturing. Real scholarship is not emotional. Real scholarship, doesn't include the 5 senses, right? It is a neck-up experience. So how do we shed those devastating and debilitating standards that were placed in our head, and try to do things that are more engaging and provide more freedom and more creativity for our students?
One of the things that it's just always in my mind is thinking about the learning, the student and teacher relationship as more collaborative. I think in large part, I was just in awe of my professors as a PhD student. And they seemed like these mythical beings to me, even though now, the more I've developed as a scholar, I'm like, they're human beings, but while I was a student, that was my posture toward them. And I realize now, the longer I've been teaching, how much students contribute to a class. They contribute to my own learning, and they contribute to their colleagues. And so at least from my perspective, the first thing that comes to mind, the first thing I thought of when you asked that question, is thinking about how the students in a lot of ways co-teach. I mean, they don't have the same expertise, and they're not designing the course in the same way. But I learned so much from them. And I didn't realize how much I think that my professors were learning from the students in my class as well.
So Bell Hooks in Teaching to Transgress tells the story of working with a group of students to be more liberatory, to encourage them to ask the questions that they want to ask, not the questions we inflict upon them, to explore their own curiosities. And then she was away from the class, like for a session, and they quickly reverted back to the old way. So then when she came back and they described what had happened with the substitute, professor, she said to them how disappointed that she was of them for not holding what they had learned from her, but so quickly reverting back to a more hostile and debilitating form of education. I think it's difficult. I think what we're talking about is very difficult, just because students have been trained as good students to be complicit with even us. So when we try to do a different thing, right, they signal to us, we'll comply with that.
Right. We've all had success with those ways. And so, we all have gotten to this place because we were good students in those traditional ways. And I should say that I think there's space for the good lecture. I think it's still, I don't want to eliminate that, but there is a whole array of possibilities. If your ultimate goal is learning and formation, you should not limit yourself to, there's a whole array of possibilities. And I think if we're called to teach with our full embodied selves, then the best we can do is to lean into the creativity and imagination on delivering education in ways beyond what we received, even though we thrived under that way as well. But I think there's even the senses that there's something about inclusiveness too. We learn differently, and certain people will learn tremendously from the potluck, where they invoke a sense of taste alongside with what they're learning, visually, auditorily. And I think a good teaching will creatively seek ways where we can cover all those ways, not just to be diverse and inclusive, but also to maximize every student's learning potential according to those arrays of delivery methods.
So much of learning is about memory, not all of it, but so much of it. So how do you help your students remember what the priorities are in the theories and experiences you're trying to teach them, right? So that's why I do the multisensory thing. So if you can help them, and memory is carried, we know from neuroscience, memory is carried in the body, not necessarily just in the brain, right? So there's all kinds of links to why we want to teach in ways that are more expansive, that are more generative. So Roger, you mentioned, I think, a very important aspect that I want to go to now is the politics of imagination in scholarship. And that was your last point in the PowerPoint, right? So we have to be savvy and have mentors about kind of when to show them, when to hold them, when to fold them, right? To use a card playing analogy. I want you both to talk more about the politics of imagination in scholarship.
Right. So there's some unwritten guild rules, and they're also written in the form of your faculty handbook on conditions for tenure and advancement. And the faculty handbook is, it's probably one of the most boring genres of literature out there, but it's really important to understand because it is a legal contract and it does give you legal expectations and also support. If you fill these, then you are entitled to promotion tenure. And so there's a part where I think early career scholars, especially those embodied in different ways, need to be very savvy on how they negotiate their usage of creativity and imagination. I think under the long trajectory, the single monograph standard is going to slowly go away. But we all know that the academy changes one death at a time. It's so slow to change. And so I don't think early career scholars should risk that, and they have to create that protection for themselves by kind of following the norms of that monograph or peer-reviewed articles, whatever the standards of your institution are. And so there's a place where I think early career scholars need to be judicious in how they exhibit their creativity in their scholarship, if that's the basis of their political safety at a particular institution.
And I think that goes hand in hand with that is mentoring, right?
Yeah.
So you have your contract, you have your faculty handbook, your tenure policies, you interpret them. You also need a mentor to help you interpret them, to help you read the context, know what is expected. And as you move into unorthodox waters, is that acceptable and encouraged? Because not all faculties are the same. Some faculties are encouraging people to be creative, to be imaginative, to expand their repertoire for teaching, to have a deeper connection with students, to move further into formation
And
that is generative.
That is part of the reading the institution and understand the contract. And certainly there will be institutions that can do that. But yeah, a typical mentoring conversation that I could have is, of course, this publication will be open access and available to the public and much more equitable, but you really need the university press. I don't care that it costs $120 for your first book. This is going to do a lot more for the next 3 decades of career if you get this with this university press. And I'm sorry you can't gift it to all your relatives because it costs $120, but trust me, all your relatives want you to stay as a professor. So we'll save that open access for a couple of years down the line once you get tenure. Those are the type of decisions that I think the mentoring shapes and hopes in, and not just for tenure, but think about the grants that you're going to apply for and sabbaticals and those types of things. I think that's part of the key of mentoring, where you are judicious in your showing of imagination and creativity.
It's funny. I was just thinking, I can't believe that when I first started teaching, no one was checking up on me, because I realized that I benefited from a lot of just, she must be doing okay, and so I in the classroom, I don't think it wasn't until my 3rd year review that I realized, oh, someone was, maybe looking at my teaching evals or paying attention, just because that was just kind of the culture of it. But I really benefited from having a mentoring voice to make sure that there was that I wasn't straying too far from whatever the accepted norms were, because so much of that stuff is not actually written down, and it gets like put under the weird and very suspect category of fit, and then sometimes you don't even know when you're stepping out of the boundaries. I remember the first year I was on faculty, a very established faculty person said, "You need to speak up more, Leah." And I just remember thinking, "No, I don't. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I don't know who's actually in charge of this conversation." It was very like, oh. So I definitely, that attention, the things that help you get through some aspects of a PhD program, you get through your exams, you do your languages, there's these just clear steps. A lot of that is very ambiguous in the first years of, at least for me in the teaching career. I couldn't even tell who was really in charge of a meeting, half the time. So I appreciate, that mentoring is so important. And then just, at least my strategy was, I need to listen really carefully to what's going on in whatever meeting I was in, to make sure what's going on here.
Teaching is so privatized, right? So we depend on, and we have built structures to privatize whatever happens in those spaces called adult classrooms. So that works well, because then you're left to your own devices, or it's benign neglect. Neither one is good for the learner or the early career person, right? So cultivating mentors and cultivating different mentors for different things. So your tenure mentor might not be the same as your teaching mentor. You need multiple kinds of mentors, not just one perspective or one person. So looking back now, and none of us are early career anymore. God bless us, right? Thank God.
It was a great season, but it's gone.
But it's gone.
Yeah.
What do you do now? Not regretting what you used to do, but what have you found yourself doing as a practice, either mind, body, or spirit, that helps you be imaginative and flourish and creative for the classroom or for the life of teaching? Because we need to be creative in our committee assignments, right? That's part of what we're talking about, in the full life of teaching, in your service responsibilities. But those things being said, are there 1 or 2 practices that you do now that give you life, that give you vibrancy, that help keep you animated with and for your students?
I think one thing is, it's going to sound very traditional, but it's not. And so I'm now enjoying the space of being mid-career and having some stability at this institution within the guild. And it allows me to ask the question, what can I do to lead the students to whatever the mission of the institution is? So the question I'm asking myself is, how are they going to, not how are they going to memorize this for the final, but how will they be transformed in ways that will be reflective 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What kind of teaching do I need to do that you're assessed beyond the 15-week final, but 15 years into a lifetime of service or ministry or, you know, whatever work you have at your institution? And I think those questions allow me to have that freedom to do very creative things, very imaginative things. You know, one example would be, back when I was in Portland, I took a bunch of mainline and some evangelical students to a place called the Middleman Jewish Community Center to learn from a rabbi. And before they even began class, you know, we found out that this community center had a bomb threat recently, an anti-Semitic bomb threat. And so they got there, they had to go to 2 levels of security to get inside the center. And once they entered, they saw all these people, old ladies playing mahjong, which is a big Jewish thing, a bunch of kids taking swimming lessons, running around. Before one word was spoken, they learned something about what it means to be Jewish in Portland, about the very ritual you need to go through in order to even meet with your community, to have a meal or to play mahjong or to do your swimming lessons or drop off your kids to have swimming lessons. And that's the type of experience that I think helped. So I was at a place where I had to worry about, you know, is this going to be bad? Is someone going to be mad at me for doing it? Is there anything, you know, I have that safety of mid-career that allows me to do that activity, which I think was truly transformative. And in certain parts, and I've spent a lot of time in like Los Angeles, so this is surprising to me, but in Oregon, there is always at least 1 or 2 students who had never knowingly engaged with a Jewish person before. And that is transformative for them. All their ideas are stereotypes portrayed through media or through what could be an anti-Semitic source for them. Their very first conversation, knowing conversation with a Jewish person. And I think that security has allowed me to not worry about what's traditionally done and to really think about what can I do, knowing that my job is secure, but my full goal is to transform the student, not for the 15-week final, but for their lifetime of service to whatever they're called to do.
I love that so much. Now I had one thing in my mind, and then you just took me on a whole other story.
Right? That was great. That's
Thank
great.
you. That was great. I think for me, you know, when you asked that question and when you prefaced it with being in mid-career, I was thinking about, like a lot of or like some women in the academy, my early career years were also my childbearing years. And that was, in fact, applying for jobs and negotiating for jobs, and then being in those first few years, I was having children, and I didn't necessarily plan it that way. You know, there are a lot of things that led into that. And I used to think of, because I didn't have a lot of models for negotiating all of that stuff at once, I used to think that the expectation for me, and probably it was for some people, was that my children were this side gig thing that I had going on. And then the real job, the real vocation was my teaching. I think I internalized that message. I think as I've grown into a mid-career scholar, and as I've benefited from, you know, a lot of people who were great advocates for a different model, and just learned and probably grown a little in confidence, I've come to see that even in my teaching, the kind of chaotic world that children inhabit in my life, because I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, so it's like constant chaos, is I've come to embrace that as a benefit to my teaching, which sounds a little crazy.
No, that's right on target as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, well, thank you. But you know, one of the things that my 5-year-old, he thinks my stories are great. I recycle fairy tales and I kind of give them twists. And he thinks that I'm just the most amazing storyteller. And so I have come to incorporate this love of storytelling in my own classes, and in particular assignments, in a couple of different ways. And one of them is I I look at my syllabus now. I try to put it all always on Google Docs, because you can put little comments or you can edit along the way. You can tag students. And I look at as a syllabus as a site for creativity. So if we are talking about something in class, if there's a great story that might benefit that whatever week we're working on, I'll put a little link in the syllabus. And I think before, at early career me, peak conformity me would have never done anything like that, because I would have worried that I was somehow tainting the seriousness of the class or the structure of the class in a way that would be, not beneficial to student learning. But I've since come to see, and student response has shown that they really enjoy that, because it feels like, oh, look, we're all thinking together. This is exciting. Sometimes I'll create a little space for students to include notes as well. I mean, I really credit that to just, in some ways it's the pragmatic impulse. I can't really do it any other way right now, because it's just, there's only so many things that can go on in my mind. And so I think that practice of just saying, I'm going to try to embrace this, instead of seeing it, instead of seeing this stage of my life as in some way, because I think many people would agree that that's not the typical, like the historic imagined way of professoring. And I've really enjoyed it. I have to say, it's not just I have to say, it's not just like a way of coping or getting through. I've just found it to be really enriching. So yeah, that's the practice that's been the sustaining, is just saying, you know what, this can be a really good thing as well.
So I learned near the end of my time in the classroom to be well rested and hydrated before I went into the classroom as a practice. That there were too many times in my own self-assessment where I was too tired to teach, right? Where I was not feeling well, where I was stressed and strained by other things and was distracted in my own classroom. Now, had you asked me that at the time, I would have said, no, I'm full of here. But so I learned to be rested so I could be present with the students who were there, which was a big thing, right? That wasn't something that I did, and I did it for my own imagination and creativity, right? That what I'm paying attention to, what I'm present to, is where my best energies are going, and I want that to go to my students. Then I learned to listen for my students' fears so I could calm them or disquiet them, right? Depending on what the situation was. But to also then, because I always thought about issues of justice and liberation, to help them experiment and try out acts of courage, right? Little acts of courage, so that acts of courage and justice are not some big ta-da thing, right? That you didn't plan the Million Man March in Washington, right? Right? So I kept waiting. I would watch their fears and try to calm their fears, or not. But then I would try to say, what little bits of courage can we do? Because I think students come to us more narrow than we wish they would. So getting them to expand, getting them to trust their own voice are acts of courage. So I would try to honor those acts of courage, in all kinds of ways. But I had to train myself to see their behaviors as acts of fear and courage, so they could do the transformative thing. So we're not just teaching toward the test. And that's part of what Roger was talking about, but we're teaching for the long haul. Doing that shifted the way I related to my students, right? Gave me different disciplines and planning for the kinds of trips we would take, the kinds of experiences we would have, the kind of learning activities I would ask them to do, what I would celebrate when they would get it right. Sometimes they wouldn't know, why is she so excited about that? Well, because I saw a fearful person do something courageous in their repertoire of courage. And I was able to see that and know that when it happened. And before I started doing those kinds of things, I think I was less imaginative and less creative, right? That to me, those were gestures of teaching imaginatively and creatively for my flourishing, as well as for my students' flourishing, because then the teaching became more meaningful to me. and not just I'm surviving in my own classroom, that I am now flourishing in my own classroom.
That phrase, listen to their fears, is so powerful. I think partially because I think the earlier generation, even current generation professors, part of them likes the fear of the student. They like that space and the reverence that they're given, which I think, I mean, there's a part of reverence, but there's also, it inflicts upon learning as well, an authentic relationship and a learning community. But the other thing I thought is like, I actually have the hydrate and be well rested. I learned I need to eat before I teach because I'm like a toddler. If I don't go without food in 3 hours, I'm grumpy or something like that. I get in a bad mood, but also I can't eat too much. Like I need to eat a proper, no big pasta meal or pizza before teaching, but just a little bit so I'm not like a grumpy
Because it's
toddler.
not just your mind that enters the classroom, your body and spirit also enter the classroom, right? That this is a human encounter, a human engagement. And if they can't sit for 3 hours, if you can't sit for 3 hours, they shouldn't be asked to sit for 3 hours, right? There's a kind of craziness we do to dehumanize our classrooms. How do we rehumanize these encounters?
I don't know about you all, but there's like every now and then, you know, I have my favorite version of myself in the classroom where it's like a student says something and then another student says something and I come up with the thing that helps the other students to get involved. And it's like this beautiful feeling. And when I'm hungry, it's like, I can't pay close enough attention. You know, when you were saying
you're distracted, right? It's all kind of distractions. How do you not be distracted in your own classroom?
And I get kind of grumpy, like, you know, what you said about listening to the fears is so key and so important. And when I'm hangry, I'm not listening. I mostly get annoyed, you know, with whatever it is. And I was just thinking when you were saying that about how I used to, when I was pregnant with one of my sons, I used to go to Taco Bell right before I taught a class because I just couldn't eat enough. And students would catch me right outside, like with a burrito, you know, just like, and then I would come in and be like, okay, I can handle the next, you know, hour to make sure, because you're so right. I mean, you might be able to rattle off the content, but really being there for the emotional space of the classroom, you got to be so sharp. So I think you're right about that.
Well, and I want my students' respect. I don't want their fear.
Yeah.
Right. I think fear is an obstacle to teaching. Respect is an invitation to teaching. So trying to move in directions of their respect for me as well as my respect for them is part of the practice of teaching.
That's a mark of more maturity. I think, you know, those who thrive on the fear of students, it's a mark of insecurity and something deeper. But you know, to be a leader of an engaged, true, authentic learning community, you don't want fear in that. You want respect and relationship and authenticity.
People, so many of our colleagues suffer from the imposter syndrome. That I don't deserve to be here. I'm not qualified to be here. You know, all those don'ts, nots, couldn't, shouldn't. I'm not able to be here. And again, I think creativity and imagination and moving out of your own fears and your own self-judgment and opening yourself to the encounter with your students might be a way to move from our own suffering into, you know, toward more survival and more flourishing in our classrooms. Thank you, Roger and Leah.
Thank you.
Always fun to chat.
Right? These three conversations, and we encourage and invite our listeners and our viewers to view all or listen to all three of the conversations meant for early career scholars, but I dare say they probably have attributes for mid and late career scholars as well, that so many of these lessons are not getting to people until later in the career. So we encourage faculties to share this information with one another.
Yeah, and if you are thriving over the fear, you might want to rethink that, you know, if that's the model. Yeah, that's the lesson for the mid and late career. Yeah.
There's someone maybe, yes, agree.
Yeah, we don't need to do a video on the meanness in classrooms, right? The disrespect of classrooms. To our viewers and our listeners, all of our resources produced by the Wabash Center can be found on our website. Also see our website for information on workshops, our syllabus program, and our grants. Many thanks to my team, Paul and Rachel, who make all of our digital resources possible. And a special thanks to Paul Myrie, whose original musical compositions frame this show, as well as all of our podcasts and educational media. And we are out.